Right, so I'm going to start with a bit of a disclaimer and apology. It's a 2-day event, started on end of November, we're now in December. That, I think, officially allows me to do one of those year in review things. You're going to see them all over the media. I think I'm officially allowed to do the first one. Great, so what we thought we would do is, picking the theme of the conference, really talk about some of the omnichannel threats and issues that we're seeing. So we've got a selection of topics. We're going to look at what's happening with attacks. What's the change in terms of growth? We're going to look at some of the big effects that there have been in regulation. We're going to look at threat takedown, threats as a business, and threats as a weapon. But it's omnichannel. So particularly the context of this is looking at messaging, signaling, voice, and applications. Starting off with messaging. Here you go. This is what the world used to look like. And this is what the world's looking like today. You can see that this is from an operator's perspective. So effectively, you could pick any network in pretty much any continent. This would be pretty much reflective of what they're seeing. Used to be that threats were about 0.1% of their entire traffic. No longer the case. It is well over 1%. Sounds like a small number, but when you're dealing with billions of messages every single day, that has turned it into a big problem. And to give you an idea as well, I mean, it looks like there's a nice gradual downward trend. Unfortunately, this is actually looking at the first 8 months of the year, and you can see again a big spike up. I know we've been talking, well, just hearing about how RCS RBM channel is nice and clean. Unfortunately, some of the big spikes are coming through things like attacks on MMS and RCS. Effectively, the attackers are getting creative. They are becoming great adopters of these new channels, this new connectivity. The sort of things that they like is it gives them fast contact. I mean, effectively, a lot of things like SMS are effectively rate limited. RCS isn't, MMS isn't. So they're using these new connectivity channels as a way of getting faster deployment. A lot of these new channels are also not protected. A lot of people bought security as a function of the node, like on the SMSC. So now they're doing it on something that doesn't necessarily have that same protection. So the evidence is in the volumes. You know, if these didn't work, they wouldn't do it. They are more commercially astute, I would say, than many marketeers, because they can immediately measure, has somebody fallen victim? It's an immediate payback for them. So growth happening. When we look now at some other aspects, I mean, what I just first showed you was a broad spectrum of attacks. When we now look at what is required of the industry to keep people safe, it's not just about attacks. And in fact, I think we'll be hearing shortly about some of the regulatory side. So I just wanted to put some of the regulatory requirements in context again of what are we seeing. Things like sender identity. In fact, I mean, the MEF themselves have been a very vocal supporter of initiatives for identity registers. So if somebody sees something bad, actually, let's put in place frameworks to be able to block it. And we're seeing this is the real effect. We are blocking tens of thousands every single day as a result of that. We are seeing things like better education on what sender identity should look like. So if something's marketing, let the end users know by the sender identity. If it's advertising, let them know. We're seeing certain territories like the Middle East adopt rules like that. We're seeing rules on prohibited behavior, things like time of day. We heard from Calera just earlier, the right message at the right time. We're seeing regulation now starting to say you can't do these things out of hours. You know, this is catching a few people doing it, but you know, this is all about awareness in the ecosystem. It's showing that it's starting to work. Putting it in context though, you know, there's still a huge amount of abuse compared to these sort of attacks. But this is the same set of data, this last one here. Remember yesterday we were hearing about fake accounts, and we were also hearing about artificial traffic inflation. That is the scale of the problem in those two areas compared to everything else. You can see it is now a huge problem for the initiative, for the industry. So effectively, that was looking at messaging. Moving on to the next channel, voice firewalling. So we're providing protection solutions again for carriers around the world against voice threats. We've been hearing about voice flash calls. We're also, though, seeing other types of techniques. I mean, Wangiri has been out there for many years, but CLI spoofing starting to come in. Again, like the previous slide we mentioned, sender identities on messaging, same thing here now on voice. One customer, about 5% of all call traffic from international sources was actually fraudulent. It's a pretty big number. So we were able to block that. Key thing is 13 different techniques were needed to try and find that fraud. You know, these folks have already evolved well beyond simple capabilities and simple detection mechanisms. They make money again by getting around controls. So to give you an idea, these sort of threats are real. But who's behind these? Don't know if you saw this headline. Yes, this was just last week. In the UK, they arrested, I think it was about 100 different people. There was also similar action occurring across Europe. I know in Ireland, they also arrested a number of folk on there. Actually, probably the folks that they've arrested are more the mules, the people sort of are responsible for the money handling behind it, rather than the actual attackers themselves. It's something that's really quite nasty. I mean, effectively what they were doing is they were using a set of services, and I'll show you what it looks like, to spoof more than 350,000 voice calls. They were then gathering data on users and using that to basically compromise those people. So bank accounts, online identities, things like Apple credentials, things like that, that have a high impact to end users. So why did they arrest them? What was actually happening? iSpoof. This was one single group that got taken down with that huge number behind it. And effectively, it's a service. It's got a set of things like DTMF decoder. If you phone someone up and you get them talking and then you get them to type something on the keypad, what number is that? Auto call robot. You can give it a script. It will then automatically call a set of numbers and then it will read out with an IVR system, an automated script. They've even got things like OTP bots. This is almost a pre-packaged solution designed to steal credentials. And the key thing is, we look at this, and this is an example of attackers using Omnichannel. Yeah, the victims are receiving a legitimate SMS, and the attackers are at the same time making a voice call saying, hey, we're the security department from Apple, First Bank, National Bank, eBay, PayPal, because they are spoofing the identity, the CLI of those industries. So on a user's phone, it will pop up with the legitimate name of those organizations because the whole system is designed that it is supposedly secure, that people can't do this. And what's really interesting is already these attack systems, I mean, there's something called root extensions. And this is a way that the attackers were trying to find multiple ways in to individual countries via different mechanisms to prevent firewall detection. So already the attackers have evolved their offering to say, we know that people are screening to say, well, HSBC Bank or Halifax Bank shouldn't come in from these connections, so don't use that number. But we know that they're not screening on these other routes in. So they've already adapted the app as a service to make it as simple as clicking on a drop down. This shows how productized, how dynamic, how fast the attackers are working in this sort of industry. They're also very business orientated. I mean, this is a poll saying, okay, what countries should we now target? You know, this is a service that was aimed at UK, Canada, US, France, Russia, but where should we target next? What are the services? They have a pre-built canned script for Apple OTP passwords. They have pre-built script for banking passwords. What other services should they do? You can see how financially orientated they are in creating solutions for customers. And you can see people are doing this. I mean, this is effectively 10,000 people who are using this to conduct attacks. Looking at applications, what's particularly interesting is, I mean, probably a lot of us have heard about FluBot, very publicized takedown in March 2021. So just as we heard with iSpoof, big takedown. Unfortunately, literally 2 months later, it cropped up again. There was another takedown. When we're seeing cooperation with law enforcement, there tends to be a lot of publicity, but it's trying to create fear. It's actually not cutting off the head of these attackers. All they're doing is actually, again, probably catching sort of the middle victims, the money mules, the people who are sort of existing in the mid-ground. They're not stopping the people behind these attacks. So I've covered voice, covered messaging, covered applications. I'm now going to actually change the positioning here on another type of attack that we've been seeing a lot in the media. And that is cyber war. We're all aware that there is, of course, the conflict going on in the Ukraine, but the role of mobile networks in that conflict is something that has never been seen before anywhere else. But I first off wanted to talk a little bit about how the media has perceived this and portrayed it. So firstly, within literally hours of the invasion, there was media attention saying Russia will launch a cyber war. Followed up a couple of days later by, actually, Russia has decided not to launch a cyber war. They're then actually really angry that they got it wrong the first time. So, well, you know, Russia is ineffective, it's out of date, they don't really know what they're doing. But actually, well, you know what, maybe actually there is a cyber war going on, but you just haven't seen it or you weren't looking in the right direction. And then, you know what, okay, final stage of acceptance. Actually, there is a cyber war, but it's a little bit different than we all thought about. And really, the reason for sort of highlighting this is that, again, in context of when we're talking about attacks, just as we saw with the iSpoof and the BBC, you know, there is a huge amount of media perception on these attacks. And really, sometimes it's not the initial perspective. Sometimes there's a lot more to it. And really, when we're looking particularly at the context of mobile infrastructure and support for security in the context of Ukraine, you know, this is something where there is a physical, kinetic, armed conflict going on at the same time. This is not an independent sort of cyber war trying to make something happen for cyber reasons. This is warfare. So really what we're seeing is that the mobile networks have had a material effect on the way that the physical warfare has been conducted. And by the way, the other very significant point in this is that a lot of the media attention has been really focused upon the role of Russia in this, whereas absolutely Ukraine, in fact, we'll explore a lot about what Ukraine have done, are a very, very significant, very creative country in defending and utilizing their telecoms infrastructure. So in a snapshot, what happened? So after invasion, the very first thing that happened within 24 hours, I mean, it wasn't, let's say, unfortunately, an unexpected event. All of the three major operators were immediately allocated additional frequencies for a couple of reasons. First off, that meant that if there was a major displacement of citizens from one location to another, that there was a capacity in the network infrastructure to be able to handle that, because cell planning at that point goes out of the window. You know, people dramatically moving locations. They also implemented a process that said people need to talk to each other. We cannot have a situation where somebody's run out of funds and they can't use their mobile phone. It is critical that people can remain in contact. So they removed the disconnection due to credit. Another first, disabling inbound connectivity. So this is about keeping citizens safe. This now is actually saying, well, actually, we've got an invasive force who are actually starting to use our infrastructure to conduct the intelligence and the exfiltration of intelligence from our country. So first ever disabling inbound rules from Russia into Ukraine. So that meant that no Russian number could actually dial into the country, and then let's block outbound calls. We then saw a next stage, which was enabling national roaming. Again, an absolute first, apart from US did it very briefly during Hurricane Sandy, enabling people to use all of the different networks. Again, it's all about coverage, all about contact. So national roaming meant no matter where folks were, you could talk across different networks if you had a cell phone connection. So that was with voice, extended it onto internet. We then were seeing some really interesting responses to these actions here. And again, I'll cover that in a couple of extra slides. So first off, let's look at the roaming. I mean, effectively, the three operators immediately were able to put in controls which stopped that inbound traffic. So planned preparedness was absolutely critical on this. You know, this is absolutely a global first of recognizing the roles that the networks have in providing connectivity and ensuring it can't be used by the aggressor. We saw the way that, in fact, this was rolled out. It started here on the eastern provinces and then was actually implemented in subsequent stages here. So again, very much a clear, planned, structured approach to how they were dealing with it. But it's not just configuration, it's not just software. There was just a phenomenal response by all of the staff, all of the employees on a continued infrastructure repair basis. I mean, the conditions by which these folks were having to restore power, backhaul connectivity, infrastructure out in the field, absolutely staggeringly impressive. The effect is that it enables Ukraine to maintain contact with folks. I mean, immediately the day after, Zelensky was posting public messages of support to his citizens from his phone saying, "We're still here." And we've all heard about the importance of troops being able to maintain contact and start sharing pictures of what they've been doing for morale and, more importantly, for the international community to gain an awareness. By sharing intelligence, by sharing information on the atrocities that are happening, the war crimes, it has helped educate the international community, which was critical for the support, for the political support for arms, intelligence, and aid donations into these regions. It's also, though, about utilizing networks for a denial of security. And by that, we mean every time a phone call is made, every time a phone is turned on, intelligence is there about whom and where. And there are rumors that that intelligence has been used to actually conduct actions. And in fact, I mean, this is an illuminating plot that was shared on the internet towards the middle of March, which actually illustrates the number of Russian registered devices present in Ukraine. So you can see there are very clear hotspots which correspond. And in fact, interestingly, this was highly beneficial for a number of reasons. First off, it showed the poor quality of Russian military communications infrastructure. They weren't using encrypted military radios. They were using their own phones. Also, poor military discipline. They didn't have their phones impounded before going on the action. They actually had their phones with them. This enabled a very clear plot of where there was Russian presence. And then I also briefly mentioned about the SIM banks. What we were seeing as well is that when the traffic was blocked from calls coming from Russia into Ukraine, the military commanders had no way of actually staying in contact either with their troops or back with their commanders. So what happened is they were establishing SIM banks using stolen infrastructure, SIM cards from Ukrainian citizens put in there. And then they were having IP connections made to the SIM boxes themselves, in order for them to appear as if it was a Ukrainian-based call to another location. But again, these things were found, seized, impounded, and detected. So you can see things like SIM boxing. It's not just an attribute of, let's say, grey root usage or a way of getting a backdoor into a network. They are being utilized in warfare now. The other thing mobile networks have is really as a benefit. They exist in everyone's hands. I mean, Ukraine, I think, has 130% network mobile phone penetration. So, you know, everyone of phone carrying age has a phone. And it's been used very effectively in Ukraine, first off for intelligence sources, for end users to be able to report, for citizens to be able to report presence of activity, being able to share information back in to, again, create this community pool of intelligence. And in fact, just even being able to connect people to information sources. So, you know, cases where folks were using a drone intelligence, a consumer drone, to pass intelligence on where troops were. But also, we've heard of cases where remote field work was being done, supported by intelligence from other sources. So there are these apps now where people can say, hey, I've just seen a missile go overhead. I've just seen a plane go overhead. I've just seen a drone go overhead. An end user can report that. That's something that has never existed in the theater of warfare before. The other critical thing as well is that I mentioned again briefly earlier, capture of the after effects of warfare, not just during the theater, but actually evidence of the war crimes that have been occurring. And again, the role of mobile phones and mobile networks in that is unprecedented. Immediate intelligence capture and secure storage of that information for subsequent processing. We've also seen how infrastructures have been able to come together. I mean, we've heard about how Starlink has been used for backhauling. You know, this is, again, an absolute first of utilizing very, very quickly completely different infrastructures to create connectivity where there were challenges and destroyal of backhaul before. We saw things like cell broadcast information and intelligence out to end users being deployed there. Another area that's happened, though, is the rise of new unlicensed operators. So we always tend to think of operators as being these big organizations with proper legitimate spectrum being allocated by big government departments that go through big bureaucratic auctions and licenses. The reality is that we have seen, particularly in Ukraine, in the Donbass region, in fact, for a number of years, two operators, unlicensed operators, spring up utilizing Ukrainian spectrum. We also have seen that the same thing has happened from Crimea. And during the initiatives of early 2022, we started to see the movement in coverage of these networks. And in fact, we've also seen from Crimea a number of new operators be set up. These ones took actually about 4 years to establish with the Donbass separation part. These ones have sprung up literally in a matter of months. What's really interesting is I would recommend, if you're finding this interesting, go to our website, have a read of our blogs, because these all look like separate networks, but actually we're able to look at how these networks are configured. We're able to look at the ways in which they are using certain network settings in common and be able to identify that actually a number of these networks are all different brands for the same source network. So it's interesting how, again, you can get this intelligence on who's doing what. You know, there's the perception for the end users, but then there's that coordination behind. There is a deliberate scheme and plan behind this. And really, it's not going to stop with just what we've seen there. You know, the ability of using real-time connectivity for intelligence on locations, on jamming, denial of service. In fact, I mean, this was, I think, really where the expectations were going to be, that there was going to be big denial of service. And there's been a lot of, again, preemptive work done by a number of nations to take down and prevent and to harden infrastructure on that space. But I think the key thing is, with this, the phones are now changing the nature of warfare. You know, we had this traditional concept of civilians and combatants. Yeah. Now, with everyone having phones in their hands, it really means that they can provide intelligence, they can provide insights, they can provide recordings, and unfortunately, that really then puts them in a greater degree of jeopardy. You know, it becomes very hard to really know, is that a soldier who's dialing in details for his platoon, or is that a civilian who is reporting something? At the end of the day, the behavior is the same, and it becomes effectively a significant risk for civilians to be doing this. So really, the future of this hybrid warfare is going to create a whole set of new areas of consideration for the concept of warfare, international criminality. So this really just covers off what we've been observing since February and March. We have actually been seeing the pre-build to this. We were uncovering sort of the nature of some of the attacks. There's one called Hidden Art, art being bear in Irish, in Gaelic, and we've seen how they've been using networks around the world without those networks' consent, or necessarily without the networks being fully aware of the nature of the interactions. But it really is starting to show that mobile networks now are fundamentally part of the way that attacks and warfares happen. So I'm going to leave you with really a question of what will 2023 bring. You know, we're seeing commercial attacks, we're seeing military utilization. The closing statement is, if these attacks didn't work, people wouldn't do them. If these attacks didn't make money, they wouldn't do them. If people didn't fall victim to these, they wouldn't do them. You know, from an end user perspective, you know, we talk about different channels. Sorry, from an industry perspective, we talk about channels. From an end user perspective, it all ends up on your phone. Pretty much most of it ends up in the same inbox. Folks are exploiting those techniques. They're exploiting human behaviors. I mean, there's a reason that we saw that voice spoofing. It's because at the end of the day, I mean, I think we're all salespeople. The way you get someone to convince is by talking to them. You know, we have the question, is voice dead? You're never going to have a sale conducted by text. It's the same thing with an attack. If you talk to someone, you can socially engineer, you can, it's a dynamic, interactive channel. And that is why attackers are really probably the first omni-channel users, and they will always continue to be aggressive omni-channel users. Thank you.
Have we got, yeah, I'm on. So Simeon, you showed that users of a mobile network, subscribers, can report information for positive use, but there can also be negative uses of it. So think of fake news. Everyone here with a smartphone is automatically a journalist. Yeah. We go around, so we have billions of journalists around the world reporting. And the key thing is, how do we, and this leads on into the next panel ultimately, is how do we verify what the truth is? Who is really the subscriber? Is it really, in your example, someone from Ukraine, or is it really from Russia, someone from Russia, or whatever it might be? How do we go about doing that? So the verification process is not easy. No, it's not going to be easy in that respect.
Absolutely not. I mean, there's been some really interesting things. In fact, if folks are interested in this, I would say go and have a read of both the BBC and Reuters have got phenomenal misinformation departments. There's some great case studies where photos have been posted up online and they've ask the question, is this real?
Yeah.
In some of those instances, they were clearly doctored photos. In other cases, they were actually able to take the fact that there were so many independent photos taken of particular events and atrocities from different angles. They were able to definitively determine that actually it wasn't a single doctor source and misinformation, that it was actually legitimate. So yeah, I think
it's kind of like blockchain. You could view it as
yes,
distributed,
absolutely.
ledger
So
distributed architecture.
So I think yeah, exactly to your point, James, the fact that you can capture more points of data from more sources, from more angles at more time, creates such a corpus of information and intelligence, whether at that initial point in time or a subsequent point in time, it will start to then further validate what actually was true or what was misinformation. But the key thing is that initial data point, it can't be taken at face value. It will take this robust inspection and testing to determine, is it legitimate or is it misinformation?
Fantastic. Have we got any questions in the room? I know we've got a lot of people watching online as well. Any questions in the room? No? Ross, anything?
No.
That's fine. No, that's fine. So,
yeah, yeah, that was great.
James Dario has a question.
No.
Sorry, it was fascinating. I actually wanted to listen a bit slowly and recatch. And a big thing came to my mind. Once upon a time, telecoms were a national structure owned by the government. Then it was privatized, it became business. Are we looking at something different now? Last week, Huawei and ZTE were banned from selling in the States. What's coming next?
What next? Really good question. I mean, short answer is I don't know. I think the key thing is things are changing so quickly for so many different reasons. I mean, yeah, the politicalization of infrastructure selection, not something that anyone, I think, well, frankly, I don't think anyone did predict that 4 or 5 years ago, because otherwise people wouldn't have made such huge investments and architecture strategies in the way they did. I mean, there was rumors and suspicion, but not to the extent that it's happened. I think, yeah, it's also interesting just seeing the speed of response. You know, again, close links between governments and these big utilities, whether they're private or public, almost irrelevant. There needs to be that close, very close cooperation at times of crisis. You know, these are infrastructures that, again, we perhaps somewhat take for granted. And I think, you know, this has probably helped highlight how utterly critical they are. You know, I would say they almost sort of sit on the Thomas Maslow hierarchy of needs. You know, folks need security, they need water, they need food, power, but contact and communication has got to be sitting in there.
I actually have a question as well. You spoke about you know, denial of service attacks like cyber warfare. How is the kind of physical damage affected, you know, network infrastructure and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the photos we showed there of folks doing repairs. I mean, yeah, there's been horrendous damage to them. You know, the networks themselves are, let's say, architecturally designed for resiliency, but when physically something is no longer connected. But I think the preparedness has meant that they've had the ability to get crews out on site to make repairs with whatever's been available to them, you know, rolling in new reels of fiber or using Starlink for backhaul. I think, you know, the creativity that's happened there, the level of effort and energy that's been applied to restoring that has been just staggering beyond belief. So yes, I think, you know, we can think it exists in, so let's say, bits and bytes and somebody with a hood hacking on a computer. But yeah, there are a lot of physical attacks that have the same effect there.
Hey, Simeon. Simeon,
Yeah.
So it's interesting, actually. I found that fascinating. I'm quite fortunate where I live because I live by MOD Caution.
Oh.
Yeah, Global Security Operations Center for the Joint Command. So I know a lot of people, obviously, who are in military intelligence and have been out in the likes of Afghanistan, likes of Ukraine, from even right the way through to the training of what's been going on with Zelensky. interestingly enough, and when you were saying about the mobile phone there and the smartphones, one thing you might not be aware of was that in Afghanistan, you had British forces using WhatsApp to communicate with each other because it was more secure than the British forces' own radio communication systems, which were being listened into by the Afghans. The interesting thing about that is that they've even looked at and having discussions within the MOD of whether RCS, where they could use end-to-end encrypted RCS with chatbots to actually utilize in warfare in the future. So I think there's so many fascinating things here. But to your point, I think, you know, with the way that communications are going and the risks associated with it, there's so many new and innovative use cases as well for the market to look at and be able to engage. So I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. Can I just chime in? I think it's a good point to talk about the little survey question we asked earlier on today when it comes to protecting consumers against fraud. Fraud could be in many ways. It could be misinformation, could be anything. Which type of stakeholder do you think should take most responsibility? There was mobile operators, messaging companies, enterprises, governments, regulators, subscribers. Guess which one came out with 55% from everybody? Mobile operators. That's correct, John JB. And next up came messaging companies with about 25%. And then governments, regulators about 15%, and enterprises, and finally subscribers. So by far and away, the feeling is that when it really, really comes to the crunch and protecting the average person on the street, even though we all say we've all got a role to play, including the subscriber themselves has got to take some responsibility, come on, it's actually the mobile operators, because mobile operators have this trusted position.
Yeah.
And it's just another example of the power mobile operators have ultimately.
Yeah. The skills, the experience, the know-how, how to keep
the recognition,
those
the
running.
brand, the trust, really, at the end of the day. And this is what we're going to be coming into next with the next panel of trust. So, Simeon, AdaptiveMobile, thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.